Hi, it's Frank. I'm once again going to be talking about progressions. This week we're building on what I talked about during our last video. The video then had to do with the progression known as 1, 6, 4, 5. As a reminder, those are the notes, those 4 chords that correspond to the root of the chord. It's in each location of that particular major scale. Using numbers, of course, so that we can take that progression and move it around. It's a very common progression, as I mentioned in that video. I cited a couple of examples of classic songwriting. I think one was by Benny King. The other one was a song by the Everly Brothers, a duo. In both cases, the chord progressions for those songs had to do with moving from the tonic chord, the 1 chord, remember, to our submediant, that's the 6th note of the major scale, whichever scale you're in, to the subdominant, to the dominant. This all built on the idea that the 3 main chords, the primary chords in any major key, and minor too, are always the 1, the 4, and the 5, tonic, subdominant, and dominant. So we had seen that in a couple videos ago in my blues progression video, and then we added to that in the last one. Today I'm going to actually deal with variations on the progressions that I just mentioned, the 1, 4, 5, as well as the 1, 6, 4, 5, which of course was also a variation. The main difference, as I mentioned as we moved out of the blues and went to that last progression in the previous video, is that we start looking at segments of songs that are 4 to 8 measures long. Today we're going to talk about, I think 5, maybe 6, looks like 5 songs that I've pulled up, which are going to show us how we can take these existing progressions, the ones I've mentioned, and actually manipulate them in small ways to create interesting songs. Just to launch right into it, the first song is called Castle on the Hill. This is by Ed Sheeran from a few years ago. And this song is actually in the key of D as in dog. As it turns out, the progression in this song, starting on the 1 chord, tonic being D, moves to instead of moving to the 6th chord, which in this case would be B minor. And by the way, here I could also use my triads on the first 3 strings, but I'm just keeping it fairly basic by using a bar shape that covers the first 5 strings. But that's my motion to start with, is the movement from 1 chord to the 6th chord. That's what we saw in the last video. Of course, if I was to continue that through, I would get to the 4 chord, which would be G, and then it would move to the 5 chord A. Just as a reminder, we're in D as in dog, 2 sharps to look out for, F sharp and C sharp. Haven't had to mess with those yet, because we're just using chords that are built off of D, B, G, and A. That would be 1, 6, 4, 5. What this song does is it takes that 1 chord and then moves it directly to the 4 chord, just like in a blues progression, then launches itself into the 6th chord, B minor, before going to the A. So what we've basically done then is taken the 1 and the 5, left them intact. They're at the beginning and end of this short progression. And in the middle, we've inverted, meaning we flipped the 2 chords that we first talked about. Instead of the 1, 6, 4, 5, in this song, we would go ahead and go right from 1 to the subdominant, then move to the submediant, and then to the A. Why do we do that? Because it's a little unexpected, that's why. If you're sticking primarily to the same tried and true progressions, it's hard sometimes to generate something which immediately grabs the listener's ear. However, the flip side of that is the more esoteric you get with your chord choices, the more you can lose listeners, especially if you're constantly grasping for the next chord that sounds like it's something brand new. So again, this idea of common tones plays into this, since I'm using the same 4 chords we talked about in previous videos, the same progression that includes 1, 6, 4, and 5. Just flipping 2 chords out of the pattern that we saw previously still introduces a new sound. That is to say that movement of 1 to 4 is pretty standard. We saw that in the blues progression, of course. But then inserting that 6th chord just before I go to 5 sustains the tension I've already created by leaving the 1 chord and going to 4. In fact, it prolongs what I'm listening for, which is that movement to the 5 chord, the dominant chord, the A in this case, which will then take me back to 1. It also offers some new harmonic choices for the melody, which today we're not examining, but again, just looking forward to that. The next song, just to move right along, uses the exact same sequence of chords, but it's by the band called Fine Young Cannibals. It's the song She Drives Me Crazy. Again, in this case, it just moves from the D to the 4 chord, and then ultimately 6 to 5. One difference here in arrangement of these chords is that most of the song is making use of what we call power chord shapes, which which rely on emphasizing the root of the chord and the fifth. That creates a slightly heavier sound if you're familiar with the song, but the truth of the matter is it's the exact same progression. So that means it's the same movement of those roots within the chord. All right, and that's the key point here. These songs, the two I just mentioned, are separated by decades. One, I think, late 80s, early 90s, and then, of course, the Ed Sheeran song within the last 8 to 10 years, I believe. But the truth is they're separated from each other by decades, and yet we're using the same progressions. And there's lots of other ones that do. That's what I mentioned in the last video you want to start becoming aware of, is listening for those repeated progressions. Once you can identify them by number especially, then you'll find it's easy to go ahead and start moving them around. So next up for us is something which is a song, I should say, that uses this progression from the blues, but inserts something new. This is the song called Knockin' on Heaven's Door. It's a famous song by Bob Dylan. I believe it's from the early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. And the idea here is we're in the key of G. So we've got our G as our tonic. Our other two primary chords would be C major and D as in dog major. For now, we're not going to worry about whether it's a seventh chord or not. We're just going to identify it by its position, meaning the note in the chord, by its position in the major scale. What happens here is we insert a new chord. In this case, it's the chord A minor. Since A is the root, you can see that that would be the second note in this scale, G, A. So it's a minor chord. We're staying all diatonic today, by the way. That A minor chord introduces a new sound, especially when it's sprinkled in amidst three major chords. Recall that the three primary chords in any major key are always going to be major, the three primary chords. So G, C, and D in this case are all major chords, but that A minor does something a little different to your ear when it hit it. In this case, the way it's used helps emphasize that. The progression in this song goes from one chord to 5, and then to the 2, the supertonic as it's called. And it sits on that for an extra measure before it returns to the G chord, goes back to 5, and then, interestingly enough, goes to 4. So here's the three main chords of our G scale, the same we would find in a blues, and they are used, but only after we've introduced a new chord first to sort of help the ear lock in, not lock in, but rather push away from the expectation. That expectation being 1, 5, 4, or even just 1, 5, 1, and then the 4 coming up after that or not. Again, if you think back to the blues progression, that was kind of broken up. You would go from 1 to 4, back to 1, then to 5, 4, 1. Here we've got those three chords, and they are broken up in different ways, but there's also a new chord that's inserted just to increase the tension as we move through the progression, ultimately getting to 5 and then coming back to 1. So once again, that A minor chord in particular really does pull your ear away momentarily. It acts as almost something deceptive as you go from the G to the D. Deceptive in the sense that you're expecting something strong, either a 4 chord or back to 1, but instead you're getting this A minor chord. All right, so again, it just prolongs the amount of tension that builds up before you ultimately resolve. The next song actually is going to use, this is Getaway Car by Taylor Swift. It's actually going to use a very similar kind of approach in the sense that it's going to use the 1 chord, it's going to use the 4 chord, it's going to use the 5 chord, and it also uses that second degree chord, the supertonic as it's called. In this case, for Getaway Car, we're in the key of C. That's our 1 chord. We're going to our 5 chord, just like we did in the previous Bob Dylan song. Now we go to our 2 chord, which in this key happens to be D as in dog minor, and then we go to our 4 chord, which I'm just playing as a simple triad. That's the note. Those are the notes that make the F chord. So once again, we've got C, G, D as in dog minor, and then F. So what was that again? 1, 5, 2, 4. So it's exactly what we saw in the Bob Dylan song before, but he broke it up a little bit differently. After that movement from 1 to 5 to 2, he followed it up with 1 to 5 to 4, a very straightforward kind of movement. Here, what we see is the repeated pattern, 1, 5, 2, 4. And as it turns out, the way Swift makes use of this and makes things a little more interesting is about halfway through the song, maybe a little more than halfway, there's a bridge which modulates, we say, into the new key. I've talked a little bit about modulation in the past. The idea is you're establishing a new tonal center. Something sounds like it's now a new home, so to speak. In this case, the whole song moves up a step. But interestingly, and is often the case, in the new key, which is D as in dog, we still follow the same progression. 1 to 5, to, in this case now, this is our 2, and then to 4. So in that key, that would be D to A to E minor to G. So it's the same progression, but a step higher. After that, I wanted to go ahead and talk about this last song. This one is called Run Around. It's actually by a band called Blues Traveler, and it makes use of the same kind of progression as the previous two songs. However, it's a little closer to the blues progression we looked at a few videos back. That is to say, we're in the key of G here. That's our 1 chord, tonic. From there, we move to C, sometimes played as a so-called CAD 9, but the idea is it's still a C chord fundamentally. It then moves to a 2 chord, A minor in this key, followed by the 5 chord, the dominant chord known as D here. So G, C, A minor, D. Turns out that's basically the blues progression in this key. It's G, C, D, but we add that 2 chord to break up that movement so that it doesn't sound just like the movement of 1 to 4 to 5. Why? Because it sounds more interesting. Okay, simply put. Inserting that minor chord in there, as we saw with the Taylor Swift song and the Bob Dylan one before, pulls your ear, the listener's ear, into a slightly different direction. And since we're all diatonic, we're just working with chords that are in any given key, any of the keys I've mentioned. So it's nothing really magical in a sense of where are we getting this stuff from. It all exists within the key structure that we're already talking about. That's the important thing to remember. However, just to take a step back from that, this all starts with the idea that you have a pretty good understanding of very common progressions, like 1, 6, 4, 5. What we're going to talk about in the next video is the idea of taking that 4 chord and substituting it with something else. In this case, instead of a 4 chord at all, we're going to see a progression called 1, 6, 2, 5. And that's going to form its own backbone as far as music history is concerned. That's also a very important progression, certainly within genres like jazz or classical, but even in more popular music, we see it a lot as well. So again, we'll save that for next time. For now, hopefully you got something out of this and the idea that we're taking stuff we've already covered and starting to see variations of it that make a big difference in some very well-known songs. Take care.